a king who was never meant to rule, a woman who was never meant to be queen, yet together they carried the weight of an empire on their shoulders. In the shadows of scandal and betrayal, Britain's monarchy stood on the brink of collapse. The abdication of Edward VIII shattered royal tradition and left the throne vulnerable. The crown needed saving, and fate placed it in the hands of a man crippled by doubt, and a woman unarmed only with love and unshakable resolve. As bombs rained over London, and the world teetered on the edge of destruction, their marriage became more than a union. It became the lifeline of a nation. This is not just a love story, it's the story of how two unlikely royals turned fear into courage and despair into destiny. This is the marriage that saved the monarchy. The year was 1936. Britain stood at a crossroads. A king had abandoned his throne for love, leaving a nation stunned and uncertain. For centuries, the monarchy had been a symbol of stability, but now that very crown was slipping. Into this storm stepped a shy, reluctant prince, George, the Duke of York, known not for power or confidence, but for a painful stammer and a quiet life in the shadow of his brother. By his side, his wife Elizabeth, charming, resilient, and unyielding in her devotion. Neither sought the throne. Neither was prepared for the weight of empire. Yet destiny would call upon them to become the heart and voice of Britain at its darkest hour. Their journey would not only redefine the monarchy, it would redefine what it meant to lead. Before we continue this untold story of love, sacrifice, and survival, make sure to subscribe to History Vault. Here, we uncover the hidden truths and forgotten moments that shaped our world. Join us, and never miss the history that still echoes today. The story of King George VI and the Queen Mother begins not with them, but with a crown in crisis. The year was 1936, a year that shook the very foundations of the British monarchy. For centuries, the crown had been a symbol of stability, something untouched by scandal, something believed to be above the turmoil of politics. But that illusion would shatter when King Edward VIII, George's older brother, made a decision that stunned the world. Edward was charming, confident, and admired by many. He was the modern King Britain thought it needed. But behind the royal image, he had fallen deeply in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced once and was still married to her second husband. For a British king, this was unthinkable. The Church of England, of which the king was the symbolic head, forbade such a marriage. The British government made it clear. Wallis Simpson could never be queen. Edward refused to choose between the throne and the woman he loved. So, in December of 1936, he did the unimaginable. He gave up his crown. He abdicated. His shocking words, broadcast to the world, still echo through history. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. In that moment, Britain lost a king, and the monarchy lost its certainty. The empire stretched across continents, from Africa to Asia, from Canada to the Caribbean. hundreds of millions lived under the British crown. And yet, at its centre, the throne itself seemed fragile, shaken by scandal. Into this void stepped a man who had never expected to rule. Edward's younger brother, Albert, Duke of York. To the public he was shy, hesitant, almost invisible compared to his bold and charismatic brother. To his family, he was Bertie, a man who avoided the spotlight whenever possible. Now, with the abdication, he had no choice. He would be king. But Albert was deeply unprepared. He suffered from a severe stammer that made public speaking an ordeal. Every time he stood before a microphone, his words broke apart, halting, uneven. In an age when radio had become the voice of leadership, a king who could not speak was seen as weak. He feared ridicule. He feared failure. Most of all, he feared letting his country down. By his side, however, was a woman who would change everything. His wife, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. Elizabeth had never sought the crown either. In fact, she had turned down Albert's marriage proposal twice, reluctant to step into royal life. But when she finally accepted, she became his anchor. She gave him confidence. She believed in him when he did not believe in himself. Where Albert was anxious and reserved, Elizabeth was calm and composed, with a quiet strength that others quickly noticed. When Edward abdicated, Albert hesitated. He doubted himself. He even considered that someone else might take the crown. But Elizabeth pushed him forward. She told him he could do it. That duty was bigger than fear. And in 1937, he was crowned King George VI, with Elizabeth at his side as queen. But Britain remained uneasy. Many wondered, could this timid man and his inexperienced wife lead an empire at such a dangerous time? The abdication had damaged the monarchy's image. Rumors spread that the institution was finished, that it no longer mattered in a world marching toward modernity. Across Europe, kings and emperors had already fallen. The Russian Tsar had been executed in the Revolution of 1917. Other monarchies in Germany, Austria, and Italy had collapsed after World War I. The British crown could very well be next. At the same time, Europe was darkening. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, promising expansion and domination. Mussolini ruled in Italy. Fascism was on the march, and war was in the air. Britain needed stability. It needed a symbol to unite its people, but instead of a confident, popular king, it had George V, a man plagued with doubts who never wanted the throne in the first place. What most did not realize, however, was that this very uncertainty, this very humanity, would become his strength. Unlike his brother Edward, George did not seek glory. He sought to do his duty. He did not chase after headlines or public approval. He quietly worked, painfully pushing through his stammer with the help of a speech therapist. He trained himself to stand before microphones and cameras, even when every word felt like a mountain to climb. The people saw this struggle, and slowly, they began to respect him. Elizabeth played a central role in this transformation. She shielded him from critics. She built his confidence behind closed doors. And she charmed the public with her grace and humor. She had a way of making people feel seen. whether it was politicians, foreign leaders, or ordinary citizens. Where George often appeared stiff and nervous, Elizabeth appeared approachable and warm. Together, they formed a balance, one that neither could have managed alone. Still, in those early years, uncertainty hung in the air. Could this king, with all his limitations, withstand the storm that was coming? Could this couple, who never sought the spotlight, truly carry the monarchy forward? Few believed it. Even fewer could have imagined that it would be this very marriage, this bond between George and Elizabeth, that would not only hold the crown together, but also guide Britain through its darkest hour. The abdication crisis had left the monarchy weak, vulnerable, and deeply shaken. But from that weakness, a different kind of strength began to emerge. A strength not built on charm or charisma, but on resilience. A strength rooted in duty, love, and the determination to endure, no matter the cost. As Europe moved closer to war, Britain would soon learn that the quiet man with the stammer and the woman who stood unshaken at his side were not just replacements for a fallen king. They were the monarchy's last chance at survival. When the storm of war finally broke over Europe, Britain once again looked to its monarchy for a guidance. But this time, the man on the throne was not the confident, worldly Edward VIII who had once seemed destined to rule. Instead, it was his reluctant brother, George VI, still finding his voice, still carrying the scars of self-doubt. Yet in this moment of fear and uncertainty, he and his queen would become more than symbols. They would become the steady heart of a nation under fire. The war began in September 1939. Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain, bound by treaty and duty, declared war. Across the nation, people gathered around radios as the king's voice, halting but determined, reached their homes. That first wartime speech was a test not only of his ability, but of the crown itself. He struggled, as always, with his stammer, but he pushed through. Each word was measured, careful, deliberate. He told his people that they were facing a grave ordeal, but that with courage and faith they would endure. In living rooms and public halls across Britain, millions listened, not to a polished orator, but to a man they could trust because his words carried the weight of sincerity. For George VI, words were weapons. His stammer turned each broadcast into a battle, but it was a battle he chose to fight. His speeches became markers of hope, moments when the nation gathered to hear the voice of their king, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And in those pauses, in those halting breaths, the people heard themselves, their own fear, their own determination, their own endurance. As the war intensified, so did the king's role. The monarchy, once seen as distant and ceremonial, began to move closer to the people. George VI visited troops, inspected factories, and shook hands with workers who were building the machines of war. He donned his uniform, not just for photographs, but as a genuine expression of solidarity with those risking their lives on the front lines. He was a king transformed, not by choice, but by necessity. Yet if George gave the nation his voice, It was Elizabeth who gave it her spirit. The Queen refused to leave London, even when officials begged her to take her children to safety. Offers were made for her to live in Canada until the danger had passed. She refused. Her place, she declared, was with her husband and with her people. The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the King, and the King will never leave. With those words, she bound the royal family to Britain's fate, no matter the risk. That risk became brutally clear in September 1940 during the height of the Blitz. German bombs fell on London night after night, tearing apart homes, killing thousands, leaving the city in ruins. Buckingham Palace itself was struck more than once. Windows shattered, walls crumbled, and smoke filled the royal chambers. Instead of retreating, Elizabeth stood firm. She even remarked, after one bombing raid, that she was glad the palace had been hit, because now she could face the people of London without shame. To many, this was the turning point. The monarchy was no longer a distant institution locked away in golden halls. It was sharing in the danger, sharing in the sacrifice. When George and Elizabeth walked through the rubble of bombed neighborhoods, when they visited hospitals and comforted the wounded, people cheered them, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection. They were living the same war as their people, and that made all the difference. At the same time, George VI carried another burden: the relationship with his allies. Britain stood alone for much of the early war, and the King played a quiet but crucial role in building bonds with other nations. His visits to Canada and the United States helped strengthen ties across the Atlantic, ties that would become vital when America entered the war. George was no diplomat by nature, but his sincerity won respect. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw in him a leader who represented not pomp and ceremony, but the grit of a nation refusing to surrender. The Queen, too, became an international figure. Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe because of her ability to inspire resistance and confidence. Her speeches, her presence, her unwavering calm. These things carried weight not just in Britain, but across the world. She became a symbol of defiance, a queen who would not bow to fear. The war wore heavily on George. He was not a strong man physically, and the endless strain of responsibility took its toll. His health began to falter. He smoked heavily, and the stress of the war aged him quickly. But he did not withdraw. Instead, he pressed on, knowing that every public appearance, every handshake, every word mattered. His people were watching, and in his perseverance they found strength. By the time victory was declared in 1945, Britain had been scarred beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, the empire had been drained, and the shadow of post-war challenges loomed. But the monarchy had not only survived, it had been reborn. It was no longer seen as fragile, no longer a relic of a fading age. It had proven itself essential, not through power, but through presence. George VI and Elizabeth had done what no one thought possible. They had turned weakness into strength. They had turned doubt into trust. and they had shown that a monarchy, even in the modern world, could still matter. Not because it ruled, but because it stood with its people. Their voices, their choices, their courage during those years had saved the crown. What had begun as a crisis of abdication had become a story of endurance. And together, they had written a chapter of history that would define not only their reign, but the survival of the monarchy itself. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and Europe began to rebuild, Britain stood victorious but exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, families grieved for lost sons. And the empire that had once stretched across the world was beginning to fracture. Yet through the devastation, one institution had not only survived but had grown stronger: the monarchy. And at its heart stood King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, a couple whose partnership had become the very symbol of endurance. The war had changed them. George, once a hesitant and reluctant king, had emerged as a figure of quiet courage. His voice, though imperfect, had carried a nation through its darkest hours. Elizabeth, once seen simply as a supportive consort, had proven herself a leader in her own right, calm, unwavering, and adored by her people. Together, they had reshaped the image of the crown. No longer was it a distant emblem of tradition. It had become a living, breathing part of the people's struggle and survival. But their story did not end with victory. In many ways, the years after the war were just as challenging. Britain faced economic hardship, rationing continued, and the empire began to unravel. India gained independence in 1947, and other colonies soon followed. For the first time in centuries, the British monarchy had to adjust to a shrinking world stage. Yet the king and queen carried themselves with dignity, providing continuity at a time of rapid change. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and Europe began to rebuild, Britain stood victorious but exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, families grieved for lost sons, and the empire that had once stretched across the world was beginning to fracture. Yet through the devastation, one institution had not only survived but had grown stronger: the monarchy. And at its heart stood King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, a couple whose partnership had become the very symbol of endurance. The war had changed them. George, once a hesitant and reluctant king, had emerged as a figure of quiet courage. His voice, though imperfect, had carried a nation through its darkest hours. Elizabeth, once seen simply as a supportive consort, had proven herself a leader in her own right, calm, unwavering, and adored by her people. Together, they had reshaped the image of the crown. No longer was it a distant emblem of tradition. It had become a living, breathing part of the people's struggle and survival. But their story did not end with victory. In many ways, the years after the war were just as challenging. Britain faced economic hardship, rationing continued, and the empire began to unravel. India gained independence in 1947, and other colonies soon followed. For the first time in centuries, the British monarchy had to adjust to a shrinking world stage. Yet the king and queen carried themselves with dignity, providing continuity at a time of rapid change. Their marriage remained central to this stability. George leaned on Elizabeth for strength. She managed not only the public duties of a queen, but also the private role of keeping her husband grounded. His health had never been strong, and the stress of kingship took a heavy toll. He smoked heavily, often appeared tired, and the weight of constant responsibility wore him down. Elizabeth shielded him as much as she could, giving him confidence in public and comfort in private. Their bond was not a storybook romance filled with dramatic gestures, but it was something far stronger, a steady devotion that endured through crisis after crisis. This devotion became part of their legacy. The people saw not only a king and queen, but also a husband and wife who faced life struggles together. Their marriage humanized the monarchy, making it relatable at a time when kings and queens elsewhere were being swept away by revolution or indifference. While monarchies in Italy, Greece, and much of Eastern Europe disappeared, Britain's monarchy stood firm. It stood firm because it had been rebuilt on love, loyalty, and the image of family. Their example left a deep impression on their eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth. She grew up watching her parents face the unimaginable, the abdication crisis, the Blitz, the pressures of war, and she learned from their resilience. When George died young in 1952, it was his daughter who would take the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. The values her parents had lived by, duty, perseverance, and unity, would guide her own reign, the longest in British history. Without George and Elizabeth's example, it is difficult to imagine that the monarchy could have endured so successfully into the modern age. But their legacy was not only institutional, it was deeply personal. To the people of Britain, George VI and the Queen Mother represented honesty and sacrifice. They did not hide in safety while others suffered. They stood among their people, walked among the ruins, and shared the risks of war. That memory endured long after the fighting was over. For many, they were not just royals. They were the embodiment of national character, the proof that Britain's spirit could never be broken. George's death in February 1952 came too soon. He was only 56 years old. Years of smoking and the constant strain of kingship had ravaged his health, and he died quietly in his sleep. The nation mourned deeply. Crowds lined the streets as his coffin passed, and many wept openly for the shy man who had never wanted to be king, but who had given everything once fate demanded it. Elizabeth, now known as the Queen Mother, carried his memory forward for half a century. She never remarried, never retreated from public life. Instead, she embraced the role of matriarch, both for her family and for the nation. Through the decades, as Britain changed and modernized, she remained a constant presence, smiling, reassuring, dignified. Her long life, stretching into the new millennium, made her one of the most beloved figures in modern royal history. When she died in 2002 at the age of 101, the outpouring of grief was immense. People remembered not just a queen, but the woman who had stood by a reluctant king and, together, saved the monarchy. The legacy of George VI and the Queen Mother is not measured in battles won or laws passed. It is measured in survival of an institution, of a nation's spirit, of a tradition that might easily have crumbled under the weight of scandal and war. Their marriage was the cornerstone of that survival. It was the marriage that gave Britain stability when the world seemed to be collapsing. It was the marriage that showed the monarchy could still be relevant, not through grandeur, but through humanity. Looking back, their story reveals something profound. They were not extraordinary individuals in the way history often defines greatness. George was not a natural leader, nor was Elizabeth a revolutionary figure. But together, they became something greater than either could have been alone. Their strength lay in their partnership, and that partnership, forged in love and tested in crisis, changed the course of history. Their reign reminds us that leadership is not always about brilliance or charisma. Sometimes it is about showing up, standing firm, and refusing to abandon those who depend on you. Sometimes it is about leaning on another when the burden feels too heavy. And sometimes it is about love, not the romantic love of fairy tales, but the enduring love that builds trust, steadies fear, and inspires courage. King George VI and the Queen Mother gave Britain that kind of love, and in doing so, they saved not just each other, but the monarchy itself. Their legacy still lives on, carried by their daughter, their grandchildren, and by the enduring respect of a people who will never forget the marriage that saved the crown. The story of King George VI and the Queen Mother is not just about a marriage. It is about survival, of love, of duty, and of a monarchy that could so easily have been lost to scandal and war. Their quiet strength reshaped the crown into something more human, more resilient, and more enduring than anyone thought possible. They became the symbol of a nation that refused to break, even in the face of fire and ruin. Yet history is never still. For every story of survival, there lies another of collapse. Monarchies that once seemed unshakable crumbled into the pages of forgotten empires. And behind every crown lies a secret, a decision, a betrayal, or a hidden truth that could have changed everything. The marriage of George VI and Elizabeth saved the monarchy, but what about those rulers who lost it all? What scandals, what conspiracies, what hidden choices sealed their fate? Because in history, the crown is never safe, and the next mystery will reveal just how quickly power can be won or lost forever.